Hi guys, I want to do a couple of problems from section 1.4. The first one is number 15. One of the students has asked about it. So the question says to solve the following quadratic equation by the method called zero factor property, or to use the zero factor property. Okay, let me write the equation. So it's 5x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals to 0. Okay, so obviously I'm sure when you read the section, you understand these are called quadratic equations because they're second degree equations. So there are different methods of solving them. I believe the homework assignment covers the three method, zero factor property, which we're going to use here, also a square root property, and using quadratic formula. Okay, so some books, they call this method just use solve by factoring because we are going to factor. But this book uses the terminology using zero factor property. I think they use that because they want to make sure you understand you have to have zero. It doesn't matter which side of the equation, left or right, but you have to have zero on one side, and then of course you would have to factor the other side. That's why they call it zero factor property. Okay, anyway. So this is probably, if you're a little rusty on factoring, these are called trinomials. We have three terms, so they're called trinomials. I think in your textbook section R4, the very first chapter of this book is chapter R. If you look in section R4, they do have some factoring problem. Those are basic, supposed to be a review of basic material, which means some of the stuff you're supposed to know. I'm sure all of you know how to factor, but if you're a little rusty, you should review section R4 in your textbook. And they talk about factoring. Also, you can just look into YouTube and just type in factoring trinomials, and you also see that there are a lot of different methods. I personally use what I call the method of trial and error. So that's what I'm going to use, but there are a lot of other methods. So it doesn't really matter which method, just make sure you know at least one method in factoring, okay? So we're going to factor the left-hand side. So it's obviously to achieve 5x squared. You don't really have a whole lot of choices. 5x times x. Pretty much the only thing that gives you 5x squared. Now you want two numbers. This is important. Please pay attention. You want two numbers here. Their product should be always your constant term. Okay. So when you multiply them, you should always get the constant term. And the good news is there is only one parent number gives you a product of 2, which is of course 1 and 2. Now if this 2 was 6, you would have more possibilities. It could be 1 and 6, 2 and 3. So the bigger the number gets, you have more possibilities. Okay. But anyway, right now we have 2. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a plus 1 here and a minus 2. You have to make sure the sign adds up, right? So negative 2 times positive 1 does give you negative 2. Now it could have been also negative 1, positive 2. That product is still negative 2. So make sure the product of these two numbers, including the sign, is always a constant term. Now the way we know if these are the correct factor, this is why the method is called trial and error. So now we have to check to see if we have the right middle term. Okay, so our middle term is negative 3x, and to achieve the middle term, as you remember by FOIL method, the product of the outside plus the product of the inside, it must be your middle term. So if that adds up to be your middle term, then you have the correct factor. Okay, and if it doesn't, you go try another combination. That's why, again, the method is known as trial and error. Some of you might have learned that before in your other previous math courses. Some of you might learn something called box method. Some people use factor by grouping, but to me, it's always the easiest way to do it by trial and error. Anyway, so let's check it out, see if these are the correct factors. So 5x times 1 is, of course, 5x. Negative 2 times x becomes negative 2x. And then when you add them up, that becomes 3x. Notice that, of course, you need negative 3x, not positive. Now, the good news is anytime you're off by a sign, all you got to do is just change the sign of the numbers. You don't have to flip them. Just change their sign, and that's going to give you the correct middle term, as long as you're only off by a sign, okay? So let's go change that to negative 1. Change that to positive 2. Now we can check it again and see if it works. It should work, of course. 5x times negative 1 is negative 5x. 2 times x is 2x, and when you add them up, to get the middle term, you get negative 3x, which is exactly what the middle term is, okay? So now you know you have the right factor. This is only one method. It's known as trial and error, but there are a lot of other methods, so please make sure you go review how to factor the trinomials. Anyway, so here's where the zero factor property comes in, okay? Once you have the right factor, you have 0 on one side, look over here. So we have a product of 2 factor equal to 0. So what the 0 factor property says is whenever that happens, one of those factors must be 0. So we're going to set either 5x plus 2 equals to 0 or x minus 1 equals to 0. So now we have 2 linear first degree equations. So we're going to solve by isolating the x. We can first subtract 2 from both sides to remove the negative 2. And then, of course, to remove the 5, we'll divide both sides by 5. And that should give you your first solution. So x equals to negative 2/5 is your first solution for this quadratic equation. And again, we're doing it by the method called 0 factor property. And here, of course, obviously, to isolate the x, we're going to add 1. And of course, that becomes x equals to 1. And there is your second solution, okay? So this is kind of getting a little bit too long. So I'm going to stop this one. And then I'll do another video right now for problem number 17, okay?